You think a woman like you belongs in that chair?" The man laughed, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. Sophie's hands shook, but she didn't move. She had no idea the man watching from the glass office already knew her secret. The laughter followed her down the 40th floor hallway of Russo Capital Group, like something with teeth. Sophie Bennett kept walking, resume folder clutched to her chest, chin level, refusing to give the two junior associates by the water cooler the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Bet she thinks numbers make up for the fact she can't even fit into the elevator with the rest of us," one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice as she passed. 14 months ago, Sophie would have turned around. 14 months ago, she'd had a job, a title, a life that didn't require armor just to survive a hallway. That was before Halbrook Financial marched her out through the accounting floor, in front of 40 coworkers, and told the world she'd falsified reports. She hadn't falsified anything. She'd found something ugly, buried in someone else's books, and finding it had cost her everything she'd built. She needed this job, the way a drowning person needs air. Russo Capital Group's public records described a private investment firm with holdings in shipping, real estate, and logistics scattered across the Midwest. What the public records didn't mention, what half of Chicago whispered instead over expensive dinners, was that Damon Russo's real business moved through the ports at 3 in the morning, and that the last 3 people who'd held the analyst position she was interviewing for had quit within a month of being hired. The receptionist barely glanced up from her headset. "Bennett, Mr. Russo will see you now. Last door. Don't touch anything on his desk." The door at the end of the hall had no nameplate, as if the man behind it didn't need one. Sophie knocked twice and let herself in when a low voice told her to. Damon Russo did not stand when she entered. He sat behind a desk the size of a small boat, sleeves rolled to his forearms, tie loosened just enough to suggest a long day he didn't care to hide. His eyes moved over her once, quick and assessing, the way a man glances at something he has no intention of buying. "Sit," he said. No hello, no handshake, just the command. Absolute, unquestioned. Sophie sat. "Tell me why Halbrook Financial let you go," he said. No preamble. The question landed on the desk between them, like something loaded. "I found irregularities in a client's accounts. I reported them. My employer decided it was easier to fire me than explain why I was right. That's not what your file says. Then your file is wrong." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "You're applying for a position that requires absolute discretion, numbers that never leave this floor. Can you understand why a woman who couldn't keep quiet at her last job might not be right for that?" Heat crawled up Sophie's neck, but she held his gaze. "I can understand why a man who's never been fired for telling the truth might think honesty is a liability." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, broken only when the door opened without a knock, and a man in an expensive suit leaned against the frame, grinning, like he'd walked in on a joke someone forgot to explain to him. "Damon, you didn't tell me you were interviewing the entertainment for tonight's fundraiser," Nico Marchetti said, eyes sliding over Sophie, with the same lazy contempt as the men by the water cooler. "She's interviewing for the analyst position," Damon said, voice flat. Nico's grin widened. "That position? Come on. You need someone who can sit across from Marcus Kane's people without getting laughed out of the room. Look at her." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, precise as a blade. Sophie felt 14 months of rejection rise in her throat, and she stood before her hands could betray her by shaking. "I think I have my answer," she said, already turning for the door. "Sit down," Damon said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Sophie stopped with her hand on the handle, something in the command making her turn back, despite every instinct telling her to walk away, with whatever dignity she had left. "I said sit down, Ms. Bennett," Damon repeated, eyes never leaving hers. "We're not finished. And Nico, get out of my office before I remember you don't work for me anymore this afternoon." Nico's smile vanished. He disappeared down the hall without another word, and Sophie understood, sitting back down slowly, that she had just watched a dangerous man choose a side in a war she didn't yet know existed, and that whatever came next would cost far more than a job offer. Damon slid a folder across the desk once Nico's footsteps faded down the hall, thick, bound with a black clip. Marcus Kane owns 4 shipping companies, registered across Ohio, Indiana, and here in Illinois. On paper, he's a competitor. In practice, he's been underbidding my contracts by margins that don't make sense for a legitimate operation. I need someone who can look at his numbers and tell me what he's actually hiding. Sophie opened the folder. Rows of figures, invoices, shipping manifests, the kind of financial noise most eyes would slide right past. Hers didn't. She flipped 3 pages in silence, feeling the shape of something wrong surface the way it always did, a pattern hiding beneath other patterns. "These are inconsistent," she said. "This shipment out of the Gary terminal weighs 40% less than what was invoiced. That's not underbidding. That's someone moving product that was never on these manifests to begin with." Damon's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened. "Keep going." She did, page after page, until the folder between them was covered in pencil marks she'd made without asking permission. When she finally looked up, the office had gone quiet in a different way, less hostile, more like held breath. "You're hired," Damon said. "Just like that? You said what you saw. Most people who sit in that chair tell me what they think I want to hear." He closed the folder. "I don't pay for flattery, Ms. Bennett. I pay for truth, even when it's inconvenient. You start Monday. You'll report directly to me. Nobody else touches your files." It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something with no railing. The weeks that followed blurred into long nights on the 39th floor, one level below Damon's office, surrounded by ledgers that smelled like old paper and older secrets. Sophie learned quickly that Russo Capital Group ran on 2 currencies, money and silence, and that the men who worked there treated both like scripture. She also learned that Damon Russo did not trust easily, watched every room like he was calculating an exit, and spoke only when necessary, as if words were a resource to be spent with the same discipline as everything else. Their first real disagreement came on a Thursday, 3 weeks in, when Sophie flagged a transaction routed through one of Damon's own shell companies in the Caymans. "This doesn't match the quarterly report you gave the board," she said, sliding the printout across his desk. Damon barely glanced at it. "That transaction isn't your concern. It's $4 million, moving through an account with no documented purpose. If Kane's people are watching your books the way you're watching his, this is exactly the kind of thing that gets you both indicted. You were hired to look at Kane's numbers, not mine." "I was hired to find what doesn't add up," Sophie said, meeting his eyes without flinching, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "If you only want me to find it in other people's books, that's not an analyst. That's a scapegoat." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Something almost like respect flickered across Damon's face, gone as quickly as it came. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "That account funds something separate from the business, something I don't discuss with employees." "Then don't discuss it. But don't pretend I didn't see it either." He studied her a beat too long enough that Sophie felt her skin warm under the weight of it, and looked away first, gathering the printout back into her folder, before either of them said something neither was ready for. It was later that week, in the break room, that Sophie first noticed something small enough to mean nothing, and large enough that she filed it away anyway. Nico Marchetti stood near the supply closet with his phone pressed to his ear, voice low, and when he saw her, he ended the call fast enough that his coffee sloshed over the rim of his cup. "Didn't see you there," he said, too easily. "Long night?" "Something like that." She poured her own coffee, watching him in the reflection of the microwave door. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," Nico said, smile sliding back into place like a mask clicking shut. "Just business. You'll learn eventually. Not everything on this floor is your business to understand. She let it go, though the phrase stuck to her like a burr, and 2 days later, cross-referencing a shipment log against a payroll record out of pure habit, she found a name she didn't expect attached to an account she'd flagged the week before as belonging to Kane's network. Nico's initials, small, easy to miss, signing off on a transfer that had no earthly reason to touch his desk. She didn't say anything yet, not until she understood what she was looking at. That night, working late, she found Damon in the doorway of her office, tie gone, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, in a way she hadn't seen before. Kane requested a meeting, he said. Neutral ground, the Whitfield estate in Lake Forest. He wants to negotiate territory before this turns into something neither of us can walk back. You don't trust him. I don't trust anyone who smiles that much. He looked at her, something considering in his gaze. I want you there, watching the room the way you watch a ledger, for the number that doesn't fit. You want me in a room with the man whose books I've been quietly dismantling for weeks. I want eyes. I trust. In a room full of people I don't. The words landed heavier than he probably intended, and for a moment, something unguarded crossed his face before he caught it and put the mask back on. Kane doesn't know what you've found yet. Keep it that way. Sophie nodded, though unease settled cold in her stomach. The same instinct that had once told her something was wrong in Halbrook's books, long before she understood what. She thought of Nico's initials on that transfer, of his voice going quiet the moment he saw her in the break room, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the danger closing in on Damon Russo's empire was coming from further outside than either of them realized, or whether it had already found its way inside the building, wearing a familiar face and an easy smile. Her phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number, a single text with no name attached. Ask Nico where he was, the night Whitfield's last analyst disappeared. Sophie stared at the message until the screen dimmed on its own. No name, no number she recognized, just a single sentence sitting in her inbox like a lit match. She thought about showing Damon immediately, then thought better of it. If someone was watching closely enough to send that message, they were watching closely enough to notice if she reacted the wrong way in front of the wrong person. She didn't get the chance to dig further that week. Damon called her into his office 2 days later, with a folder thicker than anything he'd handed her before. The meeting with Kane got moved up, he said. Tomorrow night, Whitfield's estate. I need every discrepancy you found in Kane's shipping records, organized into something I can put on the table if he tries to negotiate in bad faith. That's not much time. You've had less. He almost smiled, the ghost of something unguarded crossing his face before he caught it. I've seen what you can do with a night and a pot of coffee. She worked through the evening and most of the next morning, cross-referencing manifests against payroll, freight logs against wire transfers, until the folder in front of her told a story clean enough that even Kane's lawyers wouldn't be able to argue around it. She was 3 pages from finished when she found it again. The same signature, Nico's initials, this time on a transfer that funneled $200,000 from Russo Capital directly into an account registered to one of Kane's shell companies. Her stomach turned to ice. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. This was a pattern. She almost missed the knock at her office door. Damon stood in the frame, jacket already on, car waiting downstairs. You ready? There's something I need to show you before we go. Show me in the car. We're already late. She hesitated, weighing the message from the unknown number against the transfer in front of her, and decided, against every careful instinct she'd built over the past month, to trust the man who'd hired her when no one else would. She slid the printout into her folder and followed him out. The Whitfield estate in Lake Forest looked like old money, pretending it had never touched anything dirty. Ivy climbing brick walls, a fountain that hadn't been turned off since the Reagan administration. Marcus Kane waited in the study with 2 of his men, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Silver at his temples, a watch worth more than Sophie's last 3 years of salary combined. Damon, Kane said warmly, like they were old friends instead of rivals, circling the same shrinking territory. And you brought the accountant. I've heard interesting things about you, Ms. Bennett. Have you? Sophie said, keeping her voice level, though her pulse climbed into her throat. Whitfield speaks highly of anyone sharp enough to survive Halbrook's little scandal. Kane's smile widened, and something in the way he said it made the hair on her arms rise. Though I imagine sharp minds sometimes see things they shouldn't. Damon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the negotiation that followed unfolded like a chess match, played with knives instead of pieces. Damon laying out shipping territories and contract boundaries with the same cold precision Sophie had watched him bring to every decision that mattered. Kane countering with practiced charm that couldn't quite disguise the calculation underneath. Sophie sat quietly at the edge of the room, watching faces instead of listening to words, exactly as Damon had asked. It was Ellis Whitfield, hosting the meeting from behind his own desk, who gave her the first real thread to pull. He kept glancing toward the study door every few minutes, checking his watch, a man waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. Then the door opened, and Nico Marchetti walked in. "Sorry I'm late," he said easily, taking a seat beside Kane's men instead of Damon's. A detail so small, most people would have missed it entirely. Sophie didn't. Damon's eyes flicked toward Nico for half a second, something unreadable crossing his face, before he returned his attention to Kane. The meeting ended an hour later, with no resolution and a promise to reconvene. The kind of stalemate that meant nothing had been settled, and everything remained dangerous. In the car afterward, Damon was quiet for a long time, staring out at the dark stretch of highway back toward the city. "Nico wasn't invited to that meeting," he said finally. "I noticed. He sat with Kane's men, not mine." Sophie pulled the folder from her bag, the transfer she'd found that morning still tucked inside. "There's something I should have shown you before we left." She handed it over, and watched Damon's face change as he read it. The careful composure she'd come to know over the past month, cracking at the edges, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. $200,000. My money, moving straight into Kane's accounts. With Nico's signature on the transfer, Damon said nothing for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw working once, twice. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register Sophie hadn't heard before, quiet and lethal. "He's been with this family since he was 19. I trusted him with things I never told my own father. I know this is hard to hear. It's not hard to hear. It's hard to have been wrong." He looked at her, something almost pleading beneath the anger, as if some part of him wanted her to be mistaken. "You're certain about the signature? I've spent 3 years reading handwriting people were trying to disguise. I'm certain." Damon exhaled slowly, and the car fell into a silence that felt different from every silence before it. Heavier, more dangerous, the kind that precedes a decision that can't be undone. "We don't confront him yet," he said finally. "If Nico knows we're onto him, he runs straight to Kane, and we lose whatever advantage we have left. You keep working the files like nothing's changed. I'll have someone watch every account he touches. And if he already suspects I found it?" Damon turned to look at her fully, and for the first time since she'd walked into his office in the rain, Sophie saw something in his eyes that looked less like calculation and more like fear, though not for himself. "Then you don't leave my sight until I say otherwise." The 2 weeks that followed passed in a strange, taut quiet. Sophie continued her work on the Kane accounts under Damon's careful surveillance, Nico behaving with the same easy charm as always, oblivious, or pretending to be, to the net slowly tightening around him. Damon assigned 2 of his most trusted men to shadow her at a distance, without explanation, and though Sophie chafed at first against the sense of being watched, she found herself grateful for it, on the nights she worked past midnight, and heard footsteps in the hallway that weren't her own. It was on one of those nights, exhausted, coffee gone cold beside her keyboard, that Damon appeared in her doorway again, though this time he didn't come to discuss ledgers. "You should go home," he said. "It's past 2. So should you." He almost smiled, the ghost of something unguarded crossing his face before he caught it. I don't sleep much. Occupational hazard. Bad memories or bad conscience? Both, he admitted, surprising her with the honesty of it. He stepped further into the office, closing the door behind him, out of habit rather than necessity. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither had named yet. Sophie set down her pen. You've been different since the estate. Quieter. I keep thinking about how long Nico's been lying to my face. Damon sat across from her, the picture of a man used to sitting behind a desk of command, now looking, for the first time, like someone carrying more weight than his shoulders wanted to admit. You want to know something none of my men know? I had a brother, Enzo, 4 years younger, sharper than me in every way that mattered. He wanted out of this life. Law school, a name that didn't come with a warning label attached to it. Sophie went still, sensing the fragility of what he was offering her. What happened to him? He died in a warehouse in Cicero, 4 years ago, during a deal that went bad. Damon's voice had gone flat, worn smooth from years of repetition. I was told his fiancée sold information to a rival family to cover her brother's gambling debts, that Enzo walked into an ambush because of her. I've hated her for 4 years, for something I was never entirely sure she did. Vanessa, Sophie said quietly, the name surfacing from whispers she'd overheard weeks ago near the coffee machine. Something flickered across his face, surprise that she knew, followed by something heavier. You've heard about her. Only rumors. I didn't know the rest. Now you do. He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, that she hadn't seen since the night he'd told her to sit back down in his office. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because you're tired of carrying it alone, Sophie said, holding his gaze. You don't have to perform strength around me, Damon. I've already seen you at your best, negotiating with Kane without blinking. Seeing you at your worst doesn't change what I think of you. Something in his jaw loosened, almost imperceptibly, and for one suspended moment, Sophie thought he might close the distance between them entirely. Instead, his phone buzzed against the desk, and whatever fragile thing had been building between them fractured under the sound. He read the message, and his expression darkened instantly. Nico's been seen with Marcus Kane, twice this week, outside of anything official. My man photographed them at a restaurant on the north side an hour ago. That confirms it. It confirms he's careless, not that we understand why yet. Damon stood, already reaching for his jacket. I need you to keep working the accounts like nothing's changed. Can you do that, knowing what we know? I've been doing it for weeks, Sophie said. I can keep doing it. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and warning. Be careful around him. If he suspects you've found anything, he won't hesitate. The rift came 3 days later, at a fundraiser Russo Capital hosted at the peninsula. All crystal chandeliers and old money, pretending not to notice the newer, dirtier money standing beside it. Sophie wore the only formal dress she owned, navy, modest, nothing like the silk draped over the other women in the room, and felt every eye that measured her against them, and found her lacking. She was near the bar, when Nico appeared at her elbow, 2 glasses of champagne in hand, his smile perfectly calibrated. You clean up nice, he said, considering. Considering what? Nothing. Surprised Damon brought you to something like this. He doesn't usually let the help mingle. I'm not the help, Sophie said, setting the champagne down untouched. I'm the person who's been reading your handwriting on transfers you shouldn't have touched. Maybe ask yourself why that makes you nervous. Nico's smile flickered, just for a second, before he recovered it, though something colder moved behind his eyes now. Careful. Digging where you're not wanted tends to get people hurt in this business. Before she could respond, a woman's voice cut smoothly through the noise behind them, warm and practiced, built for rooms exactly like this one. Nico, darling, You're monopolizing the only interesting person here." Sophie turned. The woman approaching was stunning in the effortless, curated way that money buys. Dark hair swept back, green eyes sharp enough to cut glass. "Vanessa Cole," the woman said, extending a manicured hand. "And you must be Damon's new little project. He's mentioned you." Across the room, Damon's head turned at the sound of that name, and Sophie watched his entire body go rigid, the mask he wore for the rest of the world slipping for just a moment, before he schooled it back into place and began crossing the floor toward them, with the deliberate calm of a man walking straight into a fight he'd spent 4 years avoiding. "Vanessa," Damon said, voice flat as glass, closing the distance between them. "You weren't invited." "I'm a donor, Damon. My name's on the list whether you like it or not." She smiled, unbothered, gaze drifting back to Sophie with practiced cruelty. "I was just getting acquainted with your new analyst. Fired from Halbrook for falsifying records, wasn't it? Brave of you to hire her. Or careless." "That's not what happened," Sophie said, keeping her voice level, though her pulse roared in her ears. "Of course it isn't, sweetheart." Vanessa's tone dripped with false sympathy before she turned back to Damon, something sharper flickering in her expression. "You collect broken things and call it loyalty. Ask Enzo how that worked out." The name landed like a blade. Damon's hand closed into a fist at his side, and Sophie thought he might actually cross whatever remained of his restraint. But a security aide appeared at his elbow, murmuring something about a call from the docks that couldn't wait, and just like that, the confrontation was swallowed by his other life. "Stay near the bar," he told Sophie. "Don't leave without me." He was gone before Vanessa's smile fully faded, and the moment he disappeared into the crowd, something shifted in her expression. Calculation, replacing bitterness. She turned back to Sophie with new interest. "You're smarter than you look," Vanessa said quietly, no longer performing for the room. "Whatever you're finding in those accounts, be careful who you show it to first." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. There's a difference, though I doubt Damon's ever explained it to you." Vanessa's eyes flicked toward Nico, who had gone very still nearby, and something passed between them too quick for Sophie to read, before Vanessa disappeared into the crowd without another word. Sophie didn't see Nico slip away through the service corridor 10 minutes later. She didn't see him lock the door to the hotel's business library, where the Kane files sat spread across a side table, exactly where she'd left them to search for Damon after the confrontation. She found the files disturbed when she returned, papers shuffled just enough to notice if you'd memorized their order the way she had. Her stomach dropped. Someone had been through them. She barely had time to process it before the real blow landed. Ellis Whitfield himself appeared in the ballroom doorway 20 minutes later, flanked by 2 board members from Halbrook Financial, his voice carrying across the room with theatrical precision. "I think this room deserves to know exactly who Damon Russo has hired to handle his most sensitive financial records," Whitfield announced, loud enough to silence half the ballroom. "Ms. Bennett was terminated from my firm for falsifying audit reports to cover fraudulent transactions. I have the documentation here, gentlemen, should anyone care to see it, before trusting her with their money." The room turned toward Sophie as one, 100 faces full of the same contempt she'd walked past in the hallway a month ago, except now it wore evening wear and held champagne flutes instead of coffee cups. Someone laughed. Someone else murmured something about Damon's judgment. "That's not true," Sophie said, her voice steady, despite the heat crawling up her neck, despite every eye in the room weighing her and finding her wanting exactly the way they always had. "I found fraud in a client's accounts and reported it. I was fired for being right, not for lying." "Convenient story," Whitfield said, smiling for the crowd rather than for her. "Perhaps Mr. Russo would like to review the documentation himself before his next quarterly report goes missing, the same way mine did." Damon returned to the ballroom in time to catch the last of it, and Sophie watched him take in the scene, Whitfield holding court, the room's contempt aimed squarely at her, and something in his face went cold in a way she hadn't seen since the night he told her about Enzo. "Ellis," Damon said, voice carrying without needing to be raised, "you brought fabricated documents to my fundraiser to humiliate an employee. That's either desperation or stupidity. I'm inclined to believe both." "Fabricated?" Whitfield's smile thinned. "Ask her yourself whether Halbrook's board had grounds to terminate her." Every eye in the room turned to Sophie, waiting. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She stood straighter instead, chin level, the same way she had 100 times before, in hallways and interview rooms, and now here, in a ballroom full of people who had already decided who she was before she opened her mouth. "I won't defend myself to a room that's already made up its mind," she said clearly. "But I'll say this. Everything I found at Halbrook was true, and everyone who tried to bury it knew that. History has a way of proving people right eventually, Mr. Whitfield. I'd be more worried about what happens when it proves you wrong." She turned and walked out of the ballroom with her head high, leaving stunned silence behind her, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Damon found her 20 minutes later on the terrace, rain beginning to fall again, the city lights blurred behind a curtain of gray. "I should have been in that room sooner. You came when it mattered." She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "Whitfield's documentation is fake, Damon, but someone had to give it to him. Someone who knew exactly what buttons to push and when. I know." His jaw tightened. The files in the library were disturbed. Nico was seen leaving that hallway 10 minutes before Whitfield walked in. Sophie's blood went cold as the pieces clicked into place. The transfer, the meeting at Whitfield's estate, the phone call in the break room he'd ended too quickly. He's been feeding information to both of them, Kane and Whitfield, which means whatever you found in those accounts is close enough to the truth that they're panicking. Damon stepped closer, something fierce and protective hardening his features. "I'm done being careful with him. Tomorrow, I find out exactly what Nico's given away, and to whom." Before Sophie could respond, his phone rang, sharp against the quiet rain. He answered, listened, and his face changed, the color draining from it in a way that frightened her more than anything Whitfield had said in that ballroom. "When?" A pause, longer this time. "Is he alive?" Sophie's chest tightened at the question hanging in the rain-soaked silence. Damon ended the call slowly, his expression carved from something grimmer than anger. "Marco," he said, meaning the older soldier who'd guarded his family for 2 decades. "Someone jumped him outside his apartment an hour ago. He's alive. Barely. Whoever did it wanted him found, not killed. A message." "What kind of message?" "The kind that means someone knows we're closing in." Damon's hand found the small of her back, guiding her inside, away from the terrace, away from anyone who might be watching from the shadows beyond the hotel's lights. "Marco was the one I had watching Nico's accounts. This isn't a coincidence." They drove to the hospital in silence, rain streaking the windows, Sophie's mind circling the same terrible arithmetic over and over. Someone had known exactly which of Damon's men to target, which meant someone inside the organization had told them. Nico, or Vanessa, or someone neither of them had considered yet. Marco was conscious when they arrived, bruised and stitched, but stubborn enough to insist on talking before the doctors sedated him again. "They knew everything," he told Damon, voice rough with pain. "Knew I was watching Marchetti's accounts. Knew the dates I'd flagged. Somebody's been reading my reports before they ever reached you." Damon's face went very still. "Who else had access to your reports?" "Just my usual channel, and whoever handles the internal server." Marco's eyes flicked toward Sophie, apologetic. "No offense meant, Ms. Bennett, but you're new. You had access too." "I never touched your files," Sophie said, though she understood the accusation living underneath the words, the same accusation that had followed her out of Halbrook 14 months ago, the same doubt she'd spent a month trying to outrun in Damon's building. "I know," Damon said quietly, before Marco could press further, before the suspicion could take root. and grow the way suspicion always did, in rooms full of frightened men. She's not the leak, Marco. Rest. We'll talk when you're stronger. In the hallway outside, waiting for an elevator that took its time arriving, Sophie finally let herself say what she'd been circling for an hour. You believed me instantly. In there, most people wouldn't have. Most people haven't watched you find fraud, buried 3 layers deep, in someone else's mistakes, for a month straight. Damon leaned against the wall, exhaustion finally cracking through his composure. You don't hide things, Sophie. I've learned that about you. If you'd found something and kept it from me, I'd have known by now. You're not built for secrets. Everyone's built for secrets when they're scared enough. Something in his expression shifted, softer than she'd expected. Are you scared? Terrified, she admitted. Someone attacked a man tonight because he was investigating the same people I've been investigating for a month. That math doesn't work out in my favor. Damon straightened, and before either of them fully understood what was happening, his hand came up to cup her face, gentle in a way that seemed to cost him everything he'd built over 4 years of careful distance. I won't let anything happen to you. You can't promise that. I can promise I'll burn this city down trying. The words came out raw, unguarded, more confession than reassurance, and for a moment, the space between them narrowed to nothing at all, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, her breath catching in her throat. His phone buzzed, shattering the moment before it could become something neither of them was ready to name. He read the message, and his face changed instantly, all warmth replaced by cold fury. It's Nico, he said. He's requesting a meeting. Tonight. Says he has information about who's really behind the leak, and he wants immunity before he talks. You don't believe him. I believe he's scared enough to try saving himself before Kane decides he's expendable. Damon was already moving toward the elevator, jaw set. Which means whatever he's about to tell us is either the truth, or exactly what Kane wants us to hear. They met Nico in a diner on the edge of the industrial district. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The kind of place chosen specifically because nobody who mattered would think to look there. Nico sat in the corner booth, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking, eyes darting to the door every few seconds, like a man who expected violence to walk through it at any moment. I didn't know it would go this far, he said, before either of them sat down. The money, the accounts. I thought I was just moving numbers around to keep Kane off our backs, while we finished a bigger deal. I didn't know about Whitfield. I didn't know they'd hurt Marco. Start from the beginning, Damon said, voice like ice over deep water. Nico's hands shook around the coffee cup. 4 years ago, after Enzo died, Vanessa came to me. She said she needed help, proving she hadn't sold him out, that the real story was buried somewhere in old shipping records nobody had looked at since the funeral. I helped her dig, because I believed her, and because some part of me never believed the story you told yourself about that night. Sophie's breath caught. Damon's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. What story? Damon said quietly, and the words carried a warning neither Sophie nor Nico could ignore. Nico glanced toward the diner's rain-streaked window before answering, as if the words themselves might summon something dangerous. About Enzo. About that warehouse. I think you've been telling yourself the wrong version for 4 years, Damon, and I think some part of you has always known it. The warehouse in Cicero, Nico said, barely above a whisper. Enzo didn't die because Vanessa sold information to a rival family. He died because of an order that came from inside our own operation, one you gave yourself, before you knew he'd be there that night. Vanessa's spent 4 years trying to prove it wasn't her fault, and Kane's had the evidence the whole time, using it to blackmail her into feeding him information about you ever since. The diner went silent, except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant hiss of a coffee machine, and Sophie watched 4 years of certainty collapse across Damon Russo's face in real time. The foundation of everything he'd built, his grief and his rage upon, crumbling into something far more devastating than betrayal. Damon didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, His voice had lost all its usual command, reduced to something raw and disbelieving. "You're telling me I ordered the hit that killed my own brother?" "I'm telling you what Vanessa found in records from that night," Nico said. "An order routed through your old lieutenant, targeting a rival warehouse for a shipment interception. Enzo wasn't supposed to be there. He went to that meeting on his own, trying to broker peace with the same family you were about to hit, because he still believed there was a way out of this life that didn't end in more bodies. Whoever gave that order didn't know he'd walked into his own family's operation until it was already over." "Who gave the order?" Damon's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Nico hesitated, and Sophie watched something like genuine fear cross his face, for the first time since she'd met him. "Whitfield," he said finally. He was handling logistics for that operation as an outside consultant. He signed off on the strike without confirming who'd be inside that warehouse. When Enzo died, Whitfield buried his own involvement and let the story about Vanessa selling secrets take root instead, because it was easier than admitting his own negligence had killed the boss's brother. The pieces slid into place with sickening clarity. Whitfield's public accusation against Sophie at the fundraiser, his desperate need to control the narrative, his willingness to fabricate documents rather than let the truth surface. He hadn't just been protecting Kane's operation. He'd been protecting a 4-year-old lie that had defined the rest of Damon's life. "And Kane's known this whole time," Sophie said slowly, "which means Whitfield's murder wasn't random. It means someone decided he'd become too dangerous to keep alive." Nico's eyes went wide. "Whitfield's dead. You didn't know," Damon said, and it wasn't quite a question, though the accusation in it had softened into something closer to bleak realization. "Which means Kane's already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were planning to trade tonight." The diner door chimed, and all 3 of them turned as a figure stepped through the rain-soaked entrance, hood pulled low, and it took Sophie a full second to recognize Vanessa Cole beneath the disguise, her usual polish replaced by something haunted and exhausted. "I followed Nico," Vanessa said, sliding into the booth without invitation, eyes fixed on Damon, like she'd been waiting 4 years for this exact moment, and still wasn't ready for it. "I heard what he told you. Every word of it is true, Damon. I've spent 4 years trying to prove Enzo's death wasn't my fault, and every time I got close, Kane reminded me what he'd do if I stopped feeding him information about you." "Why should I believe any of this?" Damon said, though something in his voice had already started to crack. "Because I loved him too," Vanessa said, and for the first time her composure broke entirely, grief bleeding through years of careful armor. "Enzo was going to marry me after he got out of this life. I watched Whitfield's negligence take him from both of us, and then I watched you blame me for it, because it was easier than facing what your own operation had done. I let you hate me for 4 years, because Kane made it clear what would happen to my brother if I told the truth." Sophie watched Damon absorb this, watched the last 4 years of his life reorganize themselves around a truth he'd never let himself consider, and felt something shift in the air between all of them, dangerous and fragile at once. "Kane's been using both of you," Sophie said quietly, working through it aloud. "Nico, to move money and information. Vanessa, to keep information flowing about Damon's operation. He's been playing a 4-year-long game to keep himself protected, while systematically undermining Russo capital from the inside. And now that Whitfield's dead," Damon said, voice hardening back into something lethal, "Kane's covering every trace that connects him to that warehouse, which means the 2 of you are the last loose ends he needs to eliminate." Vanessa's hands trembled around the coffee cup she hadn't touched. "He already tried once. That's why I came to Nico for help tonight, instead of running like I should have 4 years ago. I'm done being afraid of him." Damon's phone buzzed against the table, and the expression that crossed his face when he read the message made every hair on Sophie's arms stand on end. He turned the screen toward her without a word. A photograph. Sophie's apartment building, taken from across the street, time-stamped 20 minutes earlier, and beneath it, a message from a number none of them recognized. Tell your accountant to stop reading things that don't belong to her. Before someone teaches her a lesson, Whitfield never got the chance to finish. He knows where I live, Sophie said, the words barely a whisper. He's known for weeks, Damon said, already sliding out of the booth, voice hard with a fury Sophie had never heard, directed anywhere but at himself, which means every night you worked late in that building, every walk to your car, he's had someone watching. This ends now. They moved fast after that, Damon issuing orders into his phone before they'd even cleared the diner parking lot. Men dispatched to Sophie's apartment, to Vanessa's hotel, to every corner of the city where Kane's reach might still find purchase. Nico, shaking but resolute, offered the one thing he had left to give. I still have access to Kane's shell accounts, he said. If you want to end this tonight, instead of waiting for him to make the next move, I can get you into records that would put him away for the rest of his life. Money laundering, the hit on Whitfield, all of it. Why would you help me now? Damon said, after 4 years of helping him instead. Because Marco's in a hospital bed because of choices I made, Nico said. And for the first time since Sophie had met him, something like genuine shame crossed his face. Because I watched you interview her a month ago and decide to protect someone instead of use them. And some part of me remembered what this family used to stand for, before I let Kane buy pieces of my loyalty, one favor at a time. They regrouped at Damon's penthouse 2 hours later, the 4 of them working through the night, Sophie cross-referencing every account Nico could access against the manifests she'd already built, Vanessa providing the missing timeline from 4 years of quiet investigation, Damon coordinating with men across the city to secure everyone Kane might use as leverage. By dawn, they had enough. Financial records connecting Kane directly to the laundering operation, phone logs placing him near Whitfield's estate the night of the murder, and Nico's testimony tying every thread together into something a federal prosecutor could actually use. We move on this today, Damon said, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, though something steadier had settled there too, the look of a man who'd spent 4 years grieving the wrong villain and finally understood who deserved his fury instead. Before Kane realizes how much we already have, but Kane had never been a man who waited to be found. The call came at 9 that morning, Damon's phone ringing, with a number that made his face go cold the instant he saw it. Marcus, Damon said, answering on speaker so Sophie could hear. I hear you've been busy, Kane said, pleasant in the worst possible way. Nico's been talking. Vanessa's decided honesty suits her better than survival, and your little accountant's been building quite the case against me. I have to admit, I underestimated all of you. It's over, Marcus. We have everything we need. Do you? Something in Kane's tone shifted. Colder now. Final. I wonder if you have Marco's daughter as well. She's a sweet girl. 2nd grade, if I remember correctly. My men picked her up from school 20 minutes ago, right around the time your soldier was giving his little hospital bed confession to your friends at the FBI. The penthouse went silent, except for the sound of Damon's breathing, controlled and furious. If you touch her, I don't want to touch her, Damon. I want my freedom. Bring me every file, every record, everything you've built against me, to the old grain terminal on Torrance Avenue, by midnight, alone, no police, no federal agents waiting in the wings, and I'll return her to her father, unharmed. Bring anyone else, and you'll be identifying a body instead. The line went dead. Sophie watched Damon's hands curl into fists, watched 4 years of careful control threaten to shatter entirely. I have to go, he said, alone. That's exactly what he wants, Sophie said. You walking into an ambush without backup, so he can eliminate the one person capable of ending his operation permanently. He has a child, Sophie. I know. Her voice stayed steady, despite the fear coiling in her chest. Which is why you're not going alone, and you're not going without a plan. I'm coming with you, and I'm bringing everything I know about how Kane thinks, because I've spent a month inside his financial patterns, and patterns like his don't change just because he's desperate. Marco, discharged early against doctor's orders the moment he heard about his daughter, arrived at the penthouse with rage, steadying his still trembling hands. "I'm coming too." "You can barely stand," Damon said. "I can stand long enough to make sure Marcus Kane never threatens my daughter again," Marco said, and something in his voice left no room for argument. They arrived at the terminal separately, staggered, exactly as Sophie had insisted, Damon walking in alone as instructed, while Nico and two of Damon's most trusted men circled the perimeter unseen. Vanessa, waiting in a car, 2 blocks away, with a phone line open to federal agents Nico had already contacted. Sophie stayed hidden behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, recording device in her pocket, watching the exchange unfold, exactly as planned, until it didn't. Kane emerged from the shadows of the main structure, with Marco's daughter held loosely by one arm, and 3 men Sophie hadn't accounted for stepped out behind him, weapons raised. "You didn't come alone," Kane said, smiling at the darkness beyond Damon's shoulder. "Predictable. Bring them out, or the girl doesn't make it to see her father again." Marco stepped from the shadows before anyone could stop him, placing himself between Kane and the terminal's only clear exit, voice raw, with 4 years of loyalty finally breaking loose. "Let her go, Marcus. This ends with me, not her." Kane's smile didn't waver as he raised his weapon toward the one man in the terminal who'd spent 2 decades protecting a family that had just discovered the true cost of that loyalty. And Sophie, watching from behind the containers, understood with sudden horror that the plan she'd built to save everyone was about to cost them the one man among them who deserved saving most. The shot rang out before Sophie could scream a warning, and Marco went down hard against the concrete, blood spreading fast beneath him. Damon lunged forward, but 2 of Kane's men closed ranks, weapons trained, forcing him back before he could reach his oldest friend. "That was a warning," Kane said, voice steady despite the chaos he'd just unleashed. "The next one won't be. Bring me the files, Damon, or the girl's next." Sophie's hands shook, but her mind moved faster than her fear, cataloging the terminal the way she'd once cataloged fraudulent ledgers, exits, blind spots, the exact position of each of Kane's men relative to the loading dock behind them. She'd studied this terminal's shipping schedules for weeks as part of Kane's financial records. She knew something Kane didn't expect her to know. She stepped out from behind the containers, hands raised, files clutched against her chest. "I have what you want. Sophie, don't." Damon's voice cracked with something raw and desperate. "He wants the files. I'm the one who built them." She kept walking, slow and deliberate, watching Kane's men track her movement, watching the little girl's terrified eyes find hers. "But you should know, Marcus, that federal agents are already listening to this conversation. Nico gave them access to your accounts 2 hours ago. Whatever happens here, your empire's already finished. The only question is whether you walk out of this a murderer as well as a launderer." Something flickered across Kane's composed face, the first crack of genuine uncertainty Sophie had seen since this began. "You're bluffing. Check your phone," Sophie said. "I imagine your lawyer's already called twice." Kane's phone buzzed in his pocket at that exact moment, and the small, involuntary flinch that crossed his face told her everything she needed to know. In that half-second of distraction, Damon moved, closing the distance to the nearest of Kane's men with brutal efficiency, disarming him before the man fully registered what was happening. The terminal erupted into chaos, shouting, scattered gunfire, Sophie dropping low behind a support beam as Nico and Damon's men emerged from the shadows where they'd been positioned, evening the numbers in seconds. Kane, seeing his advantage collapse, grabbed the little girl and backed toward the loading dock, weapon raised toward her small frame, desperation replacing his earlier calm. "Nobody move, or I swear to God. Marcus." Vanessa's voice cut through the chaos, and Sophie turned to see her stepping out from behind a container of her own, having abandoned the car 2 blocks away, the moment she'd heard gunfire over the phone line. "It's over. Whitfield's dead. Nico's talked. The federal case against you is already built. Killing a child won't save you. It'll only guarantee you die in a cell instead of walking out of one eventually. You don't get to lecture me about consequences, Kane snarled, though his grip on the girl loosened fractionally, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time. I protected you for 4 years. You blackmailed me for 4 years, Vanessa said, stepping closer, despite the weapon still aimed near the child's shoulder. There's a difference, and I've spent every day since Enzo died learning exactly what it is. Sirens wailed in the distance, closing fast, and Kane's eyes darted toward the sound, calculation returning, even through his panic. In that moment of hesitation, Damon moved, faster than Sophie had ever seen a man move, closing the last 20 feet between himself and Kane before the man could react, wrenching the weapon free and driving him back against the loading dock's rusted railing with a force that ended the standoff in a single violent motion. You don't get to decide who lives for your mistakes anymore, Damon said, voice low and final, as federal agents flooded through the terminal's broken entrance, drawn by the sirens and the gunfire, and the recording Sophie's phone had captured from the moment she stepped out from behind the containers. Marco's daughter ran sobbing into the arms of paramedics who'd arrived with the agents, and across the terminal, Marco himself, blood-soaked but breathing, was already being loaded onto a stretcher, alive, stubborn enough to have survived what should have killed him. In the chaos that followed, agents cataloging evidence, Kane led away in handcuffs, his face gone slack with the particular defeat of a man who'd finally run out of moves. Damon found Sophie standing apart from it all, shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. You shouldn't have walked out there, he said, voice rough. You shouldn't have gone in alone in the first place, she said back, meeting his eyes, despite the tremor still running through her hands. We're even. Something broke loose in his expression then, 4 years of careful control finally giving way entirely. He closed the distance between them and kissed her, right there in the wreckage of everything Kane had built, rain beginning to fall again around them, and Sophie felt every ounce of fear from the last hour dissolve into something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she'd finally found somewhere she belonged. I should have done that weeks ago, Damon said against her forehead, breathing hard. You had a few things to sort out first, Sophie said, and for the first time all night, she felt him laugh, quiet and disbelieving, against her skin. Behind them, Vanessa knelt beside Marco's stretcher, tears finally falling freely for a grief she'd carried alone for 4 years, and Nico stood apart from all of it, watching the family he'd betrayed and then helped save, waiting to learn what forgiveness, if any, still remained for him. 3 weeks later, the story had rippled through Chicago's financial world like a controlled detonation. Marcus Kane's empire collapsed under federal indictment, money laundering and murder charges stacking against him faster than his lawyers could file motions to delay them. Ellis Whitfield's estate settled quietly, with the families of everyone his negligence had touched, though nothing could undo 4 years of grief built on a lie he'd buried rather than face. Halbrook Financial, staring down its own federal scrutiny, once investigators traced Whitfield's fingerprints through half its books, issued a public retraction of Sophie's termination, along with a settlement large enough to make her old colleagues' snide comments feel like ancient history whispered by strangers. Marco recovered slowly, stubbornly, his daughter visiting him in the hospital every afternoon, with drawings taped to the wall beside his bed. And when he finally returned to Russo Capital 2 months later, every soldier on the floor stood when he walked in, a silent acknowledgement of what his loyalty had nearly cost him. Nico stayed on, though nothing about his position resembled what it once had. Damon kept him close, but watched, trust rebuilt in small increments, rather than restored all at once. And Nico seemed to understand that the debt he owed would take years to repay, and accepted it without complaint. Vanessa left Chicago the week after Kane's arrest, though not before one final conversation with Damon in his office. The same room where Sophie had once sat, clutching a resume folder like armor. Sophie wasn't present for it, but Damon told her about it that night. Quiet and unguarded, in a way he'd only recently learned how to be. "I told her I was wrong," he said. 4 years wrong. I don't know if that changes anything for her, but she needed to hear it, and I needed to say it. What did she say? That she forgave me a long time ago. She just needed me to forgive myself. He looked at Sophie across the quiet of his penthouse, something settling in his expression that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like peace. "I don't think I understood what that meant, until I almost lost you at that terminal." Sophie stood on the 40th floor one final time, before her promotion took her to a corner office 2 floors up. This time not as an applicant clutching a folder like a shield, but as the newly appointed head of financial compliance, her name freshly engraved on a door where no name had been before. The same associates who'd laughed at her in the hallway a month and a half earlier passed her now with careful, deferential nods, and Sophie found she didn't need their apology nearly as much as she'd once needed their approval. She'd stopped needing either. Damon found her there after hours, the city glittering behind the glass, the way it had the night everything began. Rain long since stopped, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. Compliance head. "Direct report to me. Full authority over every account in this building," he said, leaning in the doorway the way he had that very first day, though nothing about the way he looked at her now resembled that cold assessment from weeks ago. Nico's associates in the hallway saw the memo this morning. Every single one of them. Is that supposed to impress me? No. A rare, unguarded smile broke across his face. This is. He crossed the room and produced a small velvet box. No fanfare, no theater, just the same quiet certainty he brought to everything that mattered to him. "I don't do this because I need someone, Sophie. I survived a long time without needing anyone. I'm doing this because for the first time since Enzo died, I don't want to survive alone anymore. I want to build something with you, in the open, where nobody ever gets to tell you again that you don't belong in the room." Sophie's eyes burned. 4 years of being underestimated. 14 months of being discarded. All of it dissolving into something she'd never quite let herself hope for. "Ask me properly. Marry me," Damon said, simple and absolute. The same voice that had once commanded her to sit back down in his office, and never once let go since. She said yes, before he'd even finished opening the box. And outside the glass, the city that had once dismissed her, kept right on glittering, indifferent to the woman it had underestimated, who had just proven, once and for all, that being overlooked was never the same as being unworthy, and that love, real love, never made a man weaker. It simply gave him something worth being strong for.